Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, as Africans reel from the failure of their national armies to effectively tackle insurgencies and banditry, the role of private military contractors, otherwise known as mercenaries, features ever more regularly in discussions across the continent. But even as these conflicts erupt across Africa, there are many who do not support the call for countries battling well-equipped insurgents with weak armies to embrace these mercenary fighters. We'll speak with the founder of the International Stability Operations Association, an organization that looks after the interests of private military contractors, in a moment. And later, they're calling it Nigeria's dash for gas, after President Buhari promised that his administration had finally woken up to the abundance of gas resources in the country, while at the same time seizing the opportunity of gas being a cleaner form of energy than coal or oil to tap into rising global demand for cleaner energy sources. Sounds like a plan, doesn't it? Well, yes and no. We'll speak to an expert on the gas industry here in Abuja, coming up. Now, you might have heard about the ongoing carnage and unfolding humanitarian crisis in Mozambique, happening in Cabo Delgado province in the north of the country. The ongoing Islamist insurgency has brought fresh violence in the past week. We've been talking about it here on Arise News, when the town of Palma was attacked and hundreds had to flee the fighting. The insurgency began in 2017 and it's displaced 700,000 people and cost 2,500 lives. And this recent event in Palma, involving a fight between the insurgents, the Mozambican army, and private military contractors hired by the government, is just the latest in a series of bloody attacks.
Effectively stopped Total working again, and I'm not sure that Total's announcement about a week ago that we're going to restart business and we're back in town wasn't one that was a catalyst to all of this. Having said that, what is their strategy? I have no idea. They've certainly stopped Total, and they've brought the world's attention to this place. Is that what they want? Then they might have achieved that. It is possible to regain control, but it requires a huge military effort. It'll be house clearing, which is the most difficult form of fighting that there is. I've done that. It's house to house, room to room, and then you've got to hold that as you go forward, and then you've got to have airborne support. That is what is lacking at the moment. Eye in the sky, helicopters and fixed wing. So it's a very difficult tactic to move through the area and move these people out. And I don't see that happening anytime soon.
That's Colonel Lionel Dyke there, who's leading a private army in Mozambique. Well, for his analysis of the situation in Mozambique and beyond, the involvement of private military contractors there, and the security situation in Africa in general, I'm joined now from Washington by Doug Brooks, founder of the International Stability Operations Association, an organization that looks after the interests of private contractors. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I know you had to move your schedule around a bit, and we appreciate your coming on at this time. And I don't know if you heard, probably not, Lionel Dyke there, or Dyke rather, with Colonel Dyke, who's leading a team of private sort of soldiers in Mozambique. I wonder what you know about what's going on there now, given your association's involvement with the private military industry.
To be clear, first of all, I'm speaking on my own capacity here. I'm not speaking on behalf of ISOA or any other organization. This is just my own analysis of what we have. But Dyke DAG Consulting has a small number of helicopters. They have been contracted by the Mozambican police, not the military, which is interesting. Helicopters are quite light. They have small arms, machine guns in the doors. They do use some explosives. But it's a remarkably small operation, and the problem obviously is quite large.
I mean, I'm just curious to know your own personal experience in all of this, because, I mean, I know you said you were talking as a private citizen. But you founded that organization, the International Stability Operations Association. It's recognized as the world's leading private sector association that supports international efforts in conflict, post-conflict, and humanitarian rescue operations. I mean, in other words, you guys work with mercenaries.
Well, mercenary sort of derogatory term, but no, ISOA represents contractors. About a third of them are actually security contractors that do protective security services. The other 2/3 are everything from food services to construction, demining operations, all sorts of things like that. Now, what we're talking about in Mozambique is a little bit more leaning forward, offensive operations, essentially, which has been done on a number of occasions. Now, they are not part of, there's no private military company, as they say, that is a member of ISOA. But there's lots of security companies, and the security company essentially protects a person, a place, or a thing. So a security company, for example, in Mozambique may be used to protect some of the oil or the gas facilities, or some of the other mining facilities that are going on in Cabo Delgado or something. But that's very different from what we have with Dyke, where they are actually doing offensive operations. They're actively helping the police, in this case, go after the militants. So it's a little bit of a different role. Now, doesn't mean that it's a right or wrong, but what it does mean is that they should be following certain guidelines, and they seem to be trying to, in terms of how they do their operations. They are apparently under the command structure of the police, which is important. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be transparency in their operations. I know they were pinged recently by Amnesty on some of their activities, and they say they're looking into it and that they're working with investigators, and I hope they are.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Amnesty International. You sort of pipped me there because I was going to launch into that part of the interview with you. And far be it from me to suggest anything derogatory. The term mercenary is not necessarily derogatory. It's just a term that people are more familiar with. And as you mentioned, a recent Amnesty International report on human rights abuses committed in northern Mozambique implicated the Dyke Advisory Group, and I know you don't speak for them, as well as government forces and the militants in the unlawful killing of civilians. I mean, when you hear these accusations of civilian casualties, involving military contractors, and I don't know if they're part of your International Stability Operations Association, but it certainly reflects badly on the association, doesn't it? I mean, you founded that operation, and of course it's got lots of private military contractors as a part of it.
Well, ISOA was founded based on a code of conduct and basically addressing these issues. You need to have transparency, you need to have accountability, and over the course of ISOA, and again, I'm not with them currently, I'm President Emeritus, but over the course of the organization's existence, for example, they're very much involved with the Swiss in creating the Montreux document, which clarifies how internationals are held accountable in conflict and post-conflict environments. And also the ICOCA, the International Code of Conduct, which was created for private security providers, and this association, which basically the members or companies that become part of it agree to a much higher level of transparency and accountability. They agree to follow certain guidelines and so on. It's important. And I think we're seeing a growing number of extractive companies, when they hire private security, they're making sure that they have these guidelines, are following these rules, and if possible, are part of the ICOCA, for example. And when we look back in history, some of those have been very successful. I think sit-up in Nigeria, for example, was quite successful, very short time it was there. Some have been less successful. But in every case, just because they're doing offensive operations doesn't mean they can't follow human rights guidelines, that they can't be careful in what they do, and that they can't do things in a more accountable way. I think what's interesting in Mozambique, the Amnesty report was very accurate, it was very good. But it's also clear that, while everybody is causing human rights problems, the private company is the one that's actually reached out to say, let's figure out if this is true and how we address this. In fact, the private company is much more accountable. You can fire DAG, you can't fire the Mozambique army or the Mozambique police, right? Or the militants, for that matter. So you can get the more accountability, and I think that's super important when we're talking about this kind of operation.
Well, you mentioned something, obviously, that gets everyone animated around here. You mentioned Nigeria. Were you part of that group that were here in 2015, the private military contractors that were fighting Boko Haram in the northeast?
Yeah, they did very well. And I think what's important in their operation, which is quite interesting when you look at it, they, of course, worked with the Nigerian military. So it was not just a bunch of people brought from outside to do this sort of thing. They essentially worked with the Nigerians, and in a period of a few weeks, they essentially took most of the territory that Boko Haram had captured. They took it back. It's not to say that the Nigerian military is good or bad. It's just if there's a certain level of professionalism and expertise that can be added in a certain situation, it can make a big difference. And that expertise can come from another military. You have the U.S. military now is involved in training the Mozambican military, for example. You can have other people that bring in that expertise. Whether they go in the field with the militaries they're training, that's another question. The private contractors are willing to do that. Whether a military from the U.S. or Europe or something would do that with Mozambique, who knows? Would Mozambique accept South African troops, for example, to support them? Not clear. And would you have a level of accountability with troops from another country that you do with a private contractor that you can actually fire if they mess up?
Well, I mean, what you're saying is just so interesting. I want to come back a bit more. We're going to have to take a break in a moment to the Nigerian thing. But essentially what you do is that when a conflict such as we have in Mozambique or northeast Nigeria or the Sahel breaks out, you basically help governments or companies to source private military outfits to tackle such insurgencies. Is that right? And we've got about 30 seconds.
Well, it's an option, but again, the companies don't have to actually engage in operations. You can simply be hiring expertise, former military people that served in NATO militaries, for example. It can be very useful to any country or any military that's doing these sorts of operations. Now, you want to make sure it's done professionally, accountability, and legally. You want to make sure that's in place. But certainly, when we look at Somalia and other places, you have both militaries and contractors that are basically helping to make those operations more successful.
Okay, please stay with us. We want to talk with you some more absolutely fascinating stuff. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the founder of the International Stability Operations Association, an organization that looks after the interests of private military contractors worldwide. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Zaniakulu. Now, my current guest today, Doug Brooks, is the founder of the Washington-based International Stability Operations Association, or ISOA, which was created to support the private military industry. As a howling firestorm of conflicts continues to blow through Africa from north to south, east to west, and Africans reel from the failure of their national armies to effectively tackle these conflicts, the role of private military contractors, otherwise known as mercenaries, features ever more regularly in discussions across the continent. But even as these mini revolutions erupt across Africa and more people, including non-Africans, are caught up in their net, there are many who do not support the call for countries battling well-equipped insurgents with weak armies to embrace these mercenary fighters without a cause. Well, except for the cause of money, of course. According to them, mercenaries are not the forces for change that Africa needs. And Doug Brooks, founder of the Washington-based International Stability Operations Association, or ISOA, is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Now, it's clear many countries that are battling insurgent groups basically need all the help they can get, particularly those in Africa. I mean, in March 2015, we were discussing this briefly before the break. Nigeria brought in private military contractors from South Africa and Russia and deployed them to the theater of war in the northeast against Boko Haram. They apparently helped Nigeria to recapture several towns and villages from Boko Haram, even though the Nigerians insisted they were military trainers, not mercenaries. Does that type of success make the case for bringing them back, especially now that insecurity is once again on the rise in Nigeria?
Well, contractors have never gone away. Of course, maybe in Nigeria they're not in use at this point, but I think the Nigerians need to consider they have a lot of problems up there, and the Nigerian military has some incredible people, but it also has some that are not so good. And that's been going on, I think, a long, long time. Whether contractors are the answer or not, I don't know. I think one thing we need to keep in mind in this discussion, whether we're talking about Nigeria or Mozambique or Somalia, is security is 90% of the problem, but it's only 10% of the solution. So even if you bring in contractors or foreign militaries to help, and you actually have a secure situation, you haven't solved the problem. You've put a lid on it, but you haven't solved it. And solving the problem basically involves governments working with local populations and businesses, local businesses, international investors. In the case of Mozambique, they need to be involved in the dialogue, and there needs to be a longer term solution. What's causing the problem? What is causing the insecurity that's causing the deaths and so on? And how do you address that? And that's not something that any security group, no matter how good they are, can do. There's a larger issue that has to be dealt with. And again, when you're talking about my trade association, most of the companies are not doing security. They're doing everything else, from food, supporting peacekeepers, to actually training up, for example, judges, and so you have a more fair legal system. They're professionalizing police so that the police are not causing problems. They're not creating more problems. There's all sorts of things that are involved in any sort of stability operation. But I just want to get back to the point that simply providing security, as we saw in Nigeria in 2015, that was a temporary solution, but there is no long-term result because there was no follow-up. There's no sort of larger solution, no larger way of answering the problems.
That's a very good point you make there, and that point is borne out by the facts, because I mean, after that period that you guys were in northeast Nigeria, we can see what's still going on there today. But just staying with that for a moment, do you think the issue of private military contractors, which is another word for, or phrase for mercenaries, is a sensitive one, not just for Nigeria, but for many other governments in Africa and elsewhere who see it as an admission that their national armies have effectively failed?
It's so universal. Every country, every military uses experts from other places. The U.S. uses a lot of foreign experts when they do their operations, and when they did them in Iraq, when they're doing them in Afghanistan, and so on. It's an expertise. Now, whether they're actually involved in combat, obviously, is some ethical and legal issues that have to be addressed. But the basic concept of having contractors involved, and I was going to give you an interesting example from Darfur in Sudan. During the early days of the Darfur mission, you had a Nigerian commander who was running the mission, and at one point he was flying in a helicopter, and he wanted the helicopter not to go wherever the destination was, but to go to a different destination. And it became a bit of a problem because the helicopter was a Russian helicopter, contracted, right? So does he talk to the Russians? The answer is no, because the helicopter is actually being flown by Ukrainians. Well, does he talk to the Ukrainians? No, because they're working for a British company. So does he talk to the British? Well, no, because the British company is actually working for the Canadian government, which hired this helicopter to support the mission in Darfur. So it gets complicated when you have these different nationalities involved. And legal issues, how do you hold somebody accountable when you're going through these sorts of different contractual relationships and so on? All that needs to be paid attention to when you do these missions. But nevertheless, as we've seen with UN operations, with Africa Union operations, using foreign militaries, using foreign contractors, it just makes sense. You have an industry that's global, that has personnel from all over the world, that can bring those personnel in on short notice. If you recall, there was a company called Executive Outcomes that operated in Sierra Leone and essentially ended that war in 1996. Most of the personnel from Executive Outcomes are actually Angolans. So it's sort of an interesting twist. The expertise and the capabilities you need are available all over the world, and how you bring them together in a contractual relationship, again, with the accountability and human rights safeguards that you want to have in place, that's all pretty important.
And I suppose that's where an umbrella organization like yours comes in. I mean, you can do the whole sort of gamut of security from, as you said, restoring order, I mean, the peacekeeping and all the rest of it. But, I mean, just from a lay person's point of view, me, of course, and all the rest of the people, quite a few of them who are watching, I wonder what motivates someone to go to another country to fight a war and risk their lives for someone else's cause. I mean, is it money? Is it excitement, or what?
I think anybody who joins the military does it basically because you're going to get compensated for it. I mean, there's some nationalism, obviously, if you're working in your own military. But when you're going abroad, you have to expect compensation, and you get paid for it. Now, in many cases, there's something more to that. If you are doing a significant humanitarian mission, serving in a UN mission or something like that, for example, there may be more than just whatever you get paid every day to do the job. But yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to be part of the equation. That also adds to the accountability because for all these companies, they're companies, right? You stop paying these companies, they go home, right? So instant accountability. You can get criminal accountability too, holding individuals who commit crimes. So there's a lot of that as well. And one thing that, again, not talking necessarily about the fighting side, but there was an interesting thing. Of course, Mozambique, after its own civil war, had millions of landmines that were planted all over the place, and the Mozambicans developed a real expertise in being able to pull landmines out of the ground safely. And there was actually a company that took several hundred Mozambicans, I understand it, up to the Balkans after their war to help lift landmines there. Why Mozambicans? Well, they knew what they're doing. They're not too expensive. They had a great job because they were getting paid a decent wage and getting to travel to Europe. It was just really good. And when you have that expertise, why not use it?
Well, as I said, I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating talking with you. I mean, just very briefly, we've got about a minute or less. What about the rules of engagement and standard operating procedure? I understand that private military contractors operate more like cowboys with relatively lax rules of engagement, unlike a national military force which has a much stricter operating procedure. And we've got about 30 seconds.
That's an excellent point, and that really comes down to the client. So the Mozambican government is a client, or police is a client. They set the rules of engagement, rules for use of force. That's the one that we need to look to. And those rules for any private company should be transparent and public. You should know that. You should know when, everyone should know that, and know when they're allowed to use lethal force and when not. For security companies, the ones that are protective, again, it basically boils down to three things. They can do self-defense, they can do whatever they're hired to protect, and in most countries are allowed to protect innocent civilians under mortal threat, and that's it.
Right. I wish I could talk with you some more. It's really interesting chatting with you, but we're out of time. Doug Brooks, founder of the Washington-based International Stability Operations Association, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington. And you're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we chat about Nigeria's dash for gas after President Buhari promised his administration had woken up to the abundance of gas resources in the country. Stay with us.